I had served the Duke of Fenbridge for 19 years before I understood what he was hiding, and even then he did not tell me outright. I found it the way one finds a spring beneath a field, not by being shown, but by noticing that the grass in one particular corner was always greener, always tended, no matter the season. His Grace was not a man who explained himself. Solitary they called him in the village, and solitary he was in his own hall, a duke who kept to his study, who declined 9 invitations for everyone he accepted, who had not danced at an assembly since I had known him. Solitary, and feared a little, for a silent man in a great house breeds rumor the way still water breeds mist. They said he had a temper banked like a coal fire. They said he had loved once and been burned for it. They said many things, and being his steward, and before that, the boy who had blacked his boots in his father's time, I said nothing at all, because I was the one man alive who might have known the truth and did not think it mine to give away. It began, as far as I could ever piece it together, on a November evening some 22 years past, when the Duke, then a young man newly come into his title, his father not a fortnight in the ground, rode out alone in a foul temper and a fouler storm, and lost his way near the moor road that skirts the convent grounds of St. Ismael's. I was not with him. I have only what he told me once, late, over a glass of port he did not finish, in the particular flat voice a man uses when he has decided to speak of a thing exactly once and never again. He had come upon the asylum school by its lantern light, he said, and been given shelter by the sisters who kept it, a charitable house for women left with no family of their own, raised there from girlhood in a stone building with an orchard behind it, apple and quince trees planted, the eldest sister told him, by charitable hands 100 years gone. He had meant to stay the night and ride on. Instead he had seen, through a cracked door, a small dormitory of girls asleep under thin blankets, and among them one wakeful child sitting up very straight, watching the door as though she expected someone and had long since stopped hoping it would be anyone in particular. He never told me her name that night. He did not need to. I learned it soon enough, for within the month a standing instruction arrived at the estate office in his own hand, that a sum was to be sent quarterly to the Reverend Mother of St. Ismael's, unmarked, unsigned, with no card and no crest, only the words for the girl who watches the door. I was the one who carried the drafts to the bank. I was the one who saw, over the years, how the sum grew. Enough for blankets at first, then enough for a physician when the fever came through the house, then enough for books, then enough, eventually, for an education a merchant's daughter might have envied. I never asked him why. A steward who wishes to keep his place does not ask a duke why he sends money to a house of orphaned women in the north and swears his man to silence over it. But I watched, as it is a valet's whole art to watch, and in time I understood that the money was never the strange part. The strange part was that he never went back, not for 9 years. I do not think he trusted himself to. There was 1 year, the 4th after that first storm-bound night, when a fever went through the north, and word reached Fenbridge that St. Ismael's had lost 2 of its youngest women and had a dozen more laid low. His Grace had a physician roused and sent north within the hour, at his own expense, asking no name of who was ill and who was well, only saying, "Send everything they need and send it tonight." It was 3 days before word came that she had not taken the fever, that she had in fact nursed 2 of the younger girls through the worst of it herself by candle stub, and I recall that when I brought him that letter he read it 3 times through and kept it, for I found its like among his papers years afterward, worn soft at the creases from being reread so often in the dark. He was 26 when duty finally forced his hand, for the asylum's roof had failed in an ice storm, and the Reverend Mother wrote, this time to him directly, having somehow learned the name of her benefactor from the bank's own carelessness, asking whether the anonymous gentleman who had so long sustained St. Ismael's might consent to appear before the county trustees, who were threatening to close the house and sell the orchard land to a wool merchant unless a person of standing could vouch for its continuance. His Grace read that letter at the breakfast table and did not speak for the length of time it takes a fire to burn down to embers. Then he asked me to have the carriage made ready. I did not go in with him. I stood in the yard with the horses and watched the door, the very door, I supposed, through which he had once glimpsed a wakeful girl. When he came out an hour later, his face wore an expression I had not seen on it before and would come to know well over the following years. The look of a man who has been given something he does not believe he is permitted to keep. "She teaches the younger girls their letters now," he told me in the carriage, staring out the window at the orchard passing by, bare-branched in the frost. She did not know me. Why should she? She was perhaps 6 years old the only time she saw my face, and it was dark, and I said nothing to her even then. "Will you tell her, Your Grace?" I asked, for I was younger myself in those days and had not yet learned when a question was unwelcome. "Tell her what?" he said. "That a stranger has been buying her bread for 9 years because he could not sleep after seeing her sit up in the dark. She would think it pity, or worse." He did not finish the worse. I have wondered ever since what word he swallowed, charity perhaps, or debt, or shame, though what a man of his position had to be ashamed of in doing a good and quiet thing, I could never fathom until I came to know him better and understood that the shame was never about the money at all. That was 13 years ago. I am an old man telling you a story I watched happen slowly, the way one watches a garden change, not in any single day, but suddenly, looking up, aware that what was a seedling is now a tree in flower. I set it down now because I think it the finest thing I ever witnessed in a long service, and because the lady at the center of it once told me, with her own hand on my sleeve, that she wished it known, not for pride, she said, but so that other women waiting in the dark for a door to open might have some cause to keep watching it. I should say something of myself here, though I am a small enough figure in this account. My own father served the old Duke as head groom, and I was raised half in the stable yard and half in the servants' hall at Fenbridge, closer in age to the present Duke than any other soul in that great cold house, though never his equal. I watched his father, a hard, unbending man who believed affection a weakness unbecoming a title, raise him to believe that a man of his rank need not be loved, only obeyed, and if he managed it well enough, feared. I have often thought that the 11 years of silence, the terror of being thanked, had roots in that hard schooling quite as much as in any storm-bound night on the moor road. A boy taught that love is a weakness will grow into a man who does his loving in secret, as though it were shameful rather than a thing to be given in the light. When his father died and he came into the title at not yet 21, I was made his valet, and some years later his steward besides, and so I was nearer to him through all the years that followed than any other living soul. Her name was Linnet Vane, and by the time this story properly begins she was a grown woman of 22, still at St. Ismail's, still teaching the younger women their letters and their needle, still watching doors, though by then more from habit than hope. I had met her twice on his Grace's errands over the years, and found her exactly as the Reverend Mother's letters always described. Quiet, steady, uncomplaining, with a dignity that owed nothing to her circumstances, and everything to whatever private reserve a person builds who has learned early that no one is coming, and has decided to be her own shelter regardless. She was not, I should say plainly, a beauty in the way the county understood beauty, not golden, not languid, none of the practiced arts of the assembly rooms. She had a plain gray gaze that missed very little chestnut hair she wore scraped back for work, and hands roughened from the orchard and the needle both. But there was something in her stillness that drew the eye and held it, the way a lit window draws the eye across a dark field, and I do not think I am alone in having felt it, for I watched it work upon my master like a slow and patient siege. It was in the spring of that year, 13 years ago now, that his Grace's presence at St. Ismail's became a fixture rather than an event. The roof had been mended, the orchard land secured against the wool merchant's designs, the trustees satisfied, and by rights his part in the matter might have ended there, a benefactor's duty discharged. Instead he found reasons. The drainage of the lower field required his personal inspection, he said, being adjacent to Fenbridge land, though I had managed that same drainage for 6 years without once troubling him. The Reverend Mother's accounts wanted auditing, he said, though he had never audited so much as his own wine cellar. He rode out to St. Ismail's on a Tuesday, and then on a Thursday, and then, by midsummer, on no particular schedule at all except that it was frequent. And I, who packed his bag and brushed his coat and knew his moods better than his own reflection did, understood exactly what was happening to him before he permitted himself to understand it. "You are very often at the asylum school these days, Your Grace," I ventured once, folding his greatcoat over my arm. "The orchard wants pruning before autumn," he said, not looking at me. "Sister Agatha has no head for figures." "No, Your Grace," I agreed, and said nothing further, though we both knew Sister Agatha kept the tightest ledger in the county and needed no lord's assistance with a column of sums. The truth, which I pieced together from 100 small signs the way a man reads weather from the sky, was this. He had gone to St. Ismail's meaning only to watch over her from a careful distance, as he had watched over her for 9 silent years, and instead he had begun to know her. She did not curtsy to him with the trembling deference the rest of the county offered a duke. She treated him, in the beginning, as she treated any visiting trustee, with polite, unbending correctness, for she did not know what he was to her, and had no cause to soften. And I believe that correctness undid him more thoroughly than any flattery could have, for he had spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, and here at last was a woman who wanted nothing, who did not even know there was anything to want. I recall the first time I saw them speak at length, for I had driven him out that day and waited by the orchard wall while he walked its rows with the Reverend Mother on some pretext of the harvest. Miss Vane came out to gather the younger women in for their lessons, and found him standing beneath a quince tree, quite alone, the Reverend Mother having been called away, and instead of retreating she stopped and asked him plainly why a duke troubled himself so often over an orphan asylum's orchard when he might send an agent to do it. "Because I find I like the walking," he said. "You do not seem a man who likes anything, Your Grace, if you will forgive my saying so," she answered. "You have the face of a man doing an unpleasant duty." I saw him go very still, the way he did when a thing struck near a nerve he kept carefully guarded. "Perhaps my face and my feeling are not in agreement," he said at last. "It happens, I am told, to reticent men." She studied him a moment longer than was strictly correct, and I saw something cross her expression, not recognition, for she could not have recognized what she had never consciously seen, but a kind of curiosity, as one feels standing before a locked door one has passed 100 times without wondering what lay behind it. "Then I hope, for your sake, they come to an agreement eventually," she said, and went to fetch her pupils, and left him standing beneath the quince tree with an expression I can only call helpless, though I had never in 19 years of service seen that word fit my master's face before. He did not sleep well that summer. I know this because I have dressed a man's linen every morning for the better part of 2 decades, and I know the particular crease a restless night leaves in a shirt left too long on its hook, the shadow beneath the eyes that no amount of cold water erases. He took to walking the long gallery at Fenbridge after midnight, past the portraits of dukes who had, every one of them, married for land or alliance, or at the very least a fortune to match their own, and I believe he stood before his father's portrait more than once, and asked it questions his father, being paint and canvas, was poorly equipped to answer. "Penrose," he said to me one such night, when I had come to see why his study candle still burned past 2. "If a man had done a kindness in secret for a great many years, and the object of that kindness came in time to know him only as a stranger, and then, against every design he had for his own life, came to love her, What would you say of a man who told her the truth at last? I should say, Your Grace, that it rather depended on what he feared from the telling. He was quiet a long while, turning his glass without drinking from it. I fear, he said finally, that she will hear only the money, that she will believe herself bought or pitied, or that whatever she feels toward me, if she feels anything, was manufactured by 9 years of quarterly drafts she never saw, and will doubt it was ever her own heart at work at all. I fear, he said lower, that I have loved her so long and so wrongly from such a distance, with such cowardice, that I have forfeited the right to be loved honestly in return. I did not have an answer for him that night, and I did not pretend to one. I only refilled his glass and banked the fire and left him to his portraits and his silence, as I had left him 100 times before. But I confess, I carried his words with me a long while afterward, for I had served him since he was a boy learning to sit a horse, and I had never once heard him speak so plainly of what he wanted, only of what he feared, and it seemed to me that a man who has learned to name his fear aloud has generally already decided, somewhere beneath his reticence, what he means to do about it. What he meant to do about it took him the better part of 2 more years, for the solitary Duke was not a man to be hurried even by his own heart, and in the meanwhile there was courtship of a kind, though neither of them, I think, would have called it that at the time. He brought books for her pupils and stayed to hear them recite. He had the orchard wall mended when a section fell in a winter storm, and came himself to see the work done properly, and stood beside her in the cold counting the new stones as though they were something worth counting. He asked her opinion on the estate's charity accounts, and then, having asked it, followed it, which I do not believe any other soul in the county had managed to make him do since his father's death. And slowly, so slowly I sometimes doubted my own eyes, I watched her correctness soften into something warmer, not deference. She never gave him that, but a kind of ease, a readiness to laugh at some dry thing he said, a habit of watching for his carriage on the days he was expected, though she would have denied it to her own confessor. There was a particular occasion, in the second spring of this slow courtship, when the county held its assizes ball, an affair his Grace had for years declined as a matter of course. That year he accepted, to the considerable astonishment of the whole neighborhood, and saw to it, by some quiet word I never confirmed but always suspected, that Miss Vane was among the Reverend Mother's party invited as guests. She arrived in plain gray-blue wool, unfashionable beside the satins around her, and I saw the practiced unkind glance of 2 young ladies who thought a schoolmistress had no business in that room. She did not appear to notice. His Grace, who had not danced in longer than I could number, crossed the floor directly to her before the first set had even formed, passing 2 hopeful daughters of the county's better families to do it, and asked her to stand up with him. I watched the whole room take note, the way a field takes note of the first wind before a storm. I had never seen my master's face wear the expression it wore that evening. You have made yourself the subject of every drawing-room in the county before supper is even served, Your Grace, I murmured to him at the refreshment table, for I could not entirely help myself. Let them talk, Penrose, he said, and there was a quiet relief in it I had not heard before, as though a long-carried weight had finally shifted into something bearable. I would rather be the subject of talk than go on being the subject of nothing at all, which is what I have been in every ballroom in this county for a decade. I will say plainly that I liked her from the first, and liked her more the longer I observed her, for she had none of the calculation I had seen in the handful of women who had, over the years, set their caps at my master for his title and his acres. She did not know, you understand, what she stood to gain by his notice, because she did not know what he had already given her. She liked him, I believe, for his silences, which most women found forbidding, and she seemed to find restful, as though she recognized in his reticence some cousin of her own. For she too had learned, in a house full of women with no families, to hold herself very still and give little away, and I think two such careful souls recognized each other the way two people raised in the same hard country recognize each other's accent. There was an afternoon in that first summer that I have never forgotten. A sudden storm came up over the orchard, while His Grace was walking its rows with Miss Vane and two of her pupils, and the party took shelter beneath the lich-gate at the orchard's far end. I found them there myself, having gone ahead on foot with a lantern, and hung back a moment in the hedge rather than announce myself. Miss Vane's two pupils huddled together against the gate post, laughing at their own bedraggled state, but Miss Vane herself stood a little apart, watching the rain with such open, unguarded pleasure that I scarcely recognized her correctness in it. "I have always loved a storm," she said. "The sisters used to scold me for it, but it only ever seemed to me that the sky was finally saying plainly what it had been holding back all the clear days before." "That is a rather generous way to think of a thing that will ruin your bonnet," His Grace said, and I heard, even from the hedge, something in his voice that was nearly, though not quite, teasing. "My bonnet has survived worse than honesty," she said, turning to look at him directly. "Do you never say plainly what you are holding back, Your Grace? You strike me as a man with a great deal of weather behind a very clear sky." He was silent long enough that I thought he might let the moment pass, but then he said, so quietly I nearly lost it beneath the rain, "Only rarely, Miss Vane, and never, I find, when it would do the most good to say it." I drove home that evening turning his answer over, for I had begun to suspect that whatever weather he held behind his clear sky had a good deal to do with the woman he had just been standing beside. I learned more of Miss Vane's own history that autumn, for the Reverend Mother, grown fond of me over so many errands, took to talking with me over tea while I waited for His Grace to finish his walks. Linnet Vane had come to St. Ismail's as an infant left at the gate one winter night, wrapped in a shawl with no name pinned to it, no note, nothing to say who had left her or why. She had grown up, as all the house's women did, without a single visitor ever coming to ask after her, without a birthday remembered by any hand but the sisters. She used to ask me when she was younger whether her mother was still living and whether she had been sorry, the Reverend Mother said. I never knew how to answer her kindly and honestly both, so I told her only that whoever had left her here, at least, and not somewhere colder. It explained a great deal to me of why Miss Vane held herself so still and gave so little away. She had built her whole self out of the plain fact that nothing had ever been given to her that she had not first learned to do without. It was in the autumn of the second year that the trouble came, as trouble will, from the direction one least expects, and it was this trouble, more than any courage he found on his own account, that finally forced the truth into the open. A new trustee had been appointed to the county charitable board, a Mr. Silas Grave, a man of business rather than birth, who looked upon St. Ismail's orchard land with the eye of a surveyor, calculating its worth in timber and tillage rather than its worth in the women it sheltered. He brought a motion before the board to dissolve the asylum's charter on the grounds that its benefactor was unknown, and its finances therefore, in his words, irregular and unaccountable, and that the land would serve the county better sold to settle a debt the parish itself was owed from an unrelated matter. It was, I have no doubt, a pretext dressed as prudence, for Mr. Grave had a brother-in-law eager to purchase good orchard land at a charity's forced price, but a pretext argued with enough confidence can do a great deal of harm regardless of its honesty. The Reverend Mother wrote to His Grace in some distress, for the board meant to vote within the fortnight, and no anonymous benefactor could very well stand up in a public hearing and vouch for accounts he had never let anyone connect to his name. I watched my master read that letter at his desk, and I watched him understand in the space of that reading that the secret he had kept for 11 years, he had told himself, to spare her the burden of gratitude, to spare himself the terror of being loved for his purse rather than his person, had become the very thing that might now see her home taken from beneath her. "I must go before the board," he said to me, setting the letter down with a hand that was not quite steady. As yourself, Your Grace. As myself. There is no other way to save the house without exposing everything I have spent 11 years hiding. He looked up at me, and I saw in his face something I can only describe as a man standing at the edge of a very high place, having decided at last to jump rather than climb back down. She will learn the truth from a public hearing, Penrose, in a room full of strangers, rather than from my own mouth in private, because I was too great a coward to speak sooner. I have made a very poor thing of loving her well, for all I meant it well. I said because it seemed to me the only useful thing I could say. Then go to her first, Your Grace, before the hearing. Whatever the room learns, let her not learn it from a stranger's mouth either. He did not sleep that night at all, for I came to bank his fire near 2 in the morning and found him at the window of his chamber, still fully dressed. I have rehearsed 100 ways to say it, Penrose, he told me, without turning, and every one of them sounds either like a confession of guilt or a merchant's accounting of his own generosity, and she deserves neither. I told him that a woman raised as she had been raised would know the difference between a man reciting a speech and a man finally emptying his heart. He was quiet a long moment, and then said, so low I nearly missed it, I would rather lose her having told her everything than keep her a moment longer on a lie of omission, however kindly meant. It was, I think, the bravest thing I ever heard him say, for a man may face a room of strangers with his pride intact even in defeat, but he cannot face the one he loves with anything less than his whole undefended self. He went that same afternoon, and for once I was permitted to accompany him into the house itself, rather than waiting with the horses, for the Reverend Mother had asked me to bring certain ledgers as proof against Mr. Graves' accusations of irregularity. And so I stood, that day, in the modest parlor of St. Ismael's, and witnessed with my own eyes what I had for 11 years only pieced together second-hand. Linnet Vane was called in from the schoolroom, her sleeves still marked with chalk, and she came in with the particular wariness of a woman summoned without warning to a room where a duke and a stack of ledgers await her, expecting, I think, some fault to be found with her teaching, some new economy the board wished imposed. She had no notion, none whatever, that the ledgers on the table between them bore her own name in a column stretching back to her 6th year. Miss Vane, His Grace began, and I heard in his voice an unsteadiness he had never once permitted himself in 19 years of my acquaintance with him, not even, I think, at his own father's grave. I have a confession to make you, and I find now that the moment has come that I do not know how to make it gently, so I will simply make it plainly, and beg your patience with whatever clumsiness attends it. She went very still, in the way I had come to recognize as her particular manner of bracing herself against a blow. 22 years ago, he said, I lost my way on the moor road in a storm and took shelter here for a night and saw, through a door left ajar, a girl of 6 years sitting up in the dark, watching that door as though she expected it might yet bring her someone who belonged to her. I did not speak to her. I did not even learn her name until some time after, but I could not sleep having seen her, and I have not in any real sense stopped seeing her since. He drew a breath. The quarterly sums that have sustained this house for 11 years, the roof, the physician in the fever year, the books, Miss Vane's own education beyond what the house could otherwise have afforded, those sums came from me. I asked that they be sent without name or mark, because I told myself I wished to spare the recipients the burden of gratitude toward a stranger. I have since come to suspect a less generous motive lay beneath the kinder one. That I was, in truth, protecting myself, for I did not think I could bear to be thanked for a kindness I had not the courage to offer honestly, face to face, as a man rather than a shadow. The room was entirely silent. I did not breathe, I think, for the length of his speech, and I doubt the Reverend Mother did either. I have come today, he went on, because a trustee means to close this house on the grounds that its benefactor is unknown, and I could not let that stand, whatever it cost me to be known. But I find, now that I am here, that the matter of the trustees is not, in truth, the hardest thing I came to say. He looked at her directly then, and I saw in his face the particular nakedness of a man who has decided that whatever is lost by honesty cannot be worse than what is already lost by its absence. I have watched you become the woman you are, Miss Vane, from a greater distance than I had any right to keep. And in these last 2 years, watching you at closer range, I have come to love you, not out of any duty attached to 11 years of drafts and ledgers, but for yourself, for your plain gray honesty and your steadiness and the way you make a schoolroom of orphaned women feel. I am told by every sister in this house, like the safest room in the county. I did not intend to tell you any of this today. I intended, I think, to go on hiding behind my own charity forever, being useful to you from a safe distance rather than risk being known and found wanting. But I find I would rather you be angry at the truth than grateful to a lie, and so, there it is, the whole of it. I am the man who has watched over this house since you were a girl. I am the man who has watched over you. And I love you, and I have loved you, I think, longer than I properly understood. And I have made you no offer of anything until this moment because I could not find the courage to give you the choice of me, honestly rather than as a debt you might feel obliged to repay. I have stood in a great many rooms in 19 years of service, and I have rarely known one so silent as that parlor in the seconds after he finished speaking. Miss Vane had gone very pale, and her hands, I saw, had closed on the fabric of her apron the way a person's hands close on something solid when the floor seems uncertain beneath them. "You," she said at last, and her voice was not angry as he had feared but wondering, as though she were testing a word in a foreign tongue. "You are the one, all these years. The roof, the books. Sister Agatha always said our benefactor was a mysterious sort of angel, and I used to imagine him as an old man, a merchant, someone with no face at all, because I could not imagine anyone troubling themselves so long over girls no one else wanted." She looked at him, and something in her expression cracked open, the way ice cracks on a pond in the first warmth of spring, all at once and along lines that had clearly been forming a long while beneath the surface. "I used to sit by that door, Your Grace, every night for years after you saw me. I did not know I was waiting for anything in particular. I only knew I wanted, very badly, for someone to be coming." "I am sorry it took so long," he said. "I am sorry I did not come sooner, and come honestly, and spare you every year of sitting by that door alone." "Don't be sorry for that," she said, and her voice, though it trembled, had steadied into something that sounded, to my ear, remarkably like the correctness with which she had first met him, except that now it was not correctness at all but its opposite, a plain and undefended truth. "I do not think I would trade a single one of those years, now that I know who was standing on the other side of that door, keeping me fed and taught and safe without ever once asking to be thanked for it. Do you know what it is, Your Grace, to grow up with no family of your own, and to be told, over and over, that no one is coming? I stopped believing anyone was coming a long time ago. But someone was always coming. He simply came very quietly and stayed at a distance, and never once made me feel his charity as a debt. I have spent 2 years now watching you walk this orchard and thinking you the most reticent, most careful man I had ever met, and wondering why a duke troubled himself so over an orphan asylum's drainage and its ledgers, and all the while it was because—" Her voice caught, and she pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, and when she spoke again it was steadier. "All the while it was because you had already given me your whole heart, years before I ever learned your name. And you were only waiting to see whether I might learn to want the rest of you, not knowing you had already given me everything else." "And do you?" he asked, and I had never in 19 years heard my master's voice so unguarded. "Want the rest of me? Knowing now what I withheld, and why and how long?" She crossed the small distance between them. I remember that she did not wait for him to close it, that she was the one who moved, as though 11 years of being provided for at a careful distance had earned her, in this one moment, the right to close the last of the distance herself. And she took his hand, the plain, rough hand of a woman who had spent her life at needlework and orchard chores, and closed it in both of hers. "I think," she said, "that I have been in love with a man I believe to be a stranger for 2 years and grateful to a mysterious angel for 16, and it turns out they were never two different debts of the heart at all, but one. Yes, Your Grace, I want the rest of you. I have wanted it, I think, since the day you stood beneath the quince tree with the face of a man doing an unpleasant duty, and told me your face and your feeling were not in agreement. I only wish you had trusted me sooner with which feeling it truly was." "I did not trust myself," he said, "to be loved for anything but my usefulness. It is a hard thing, Miss Vane, to be a duke. Everyone wants something of you, and after a while a man forgets what it is to be wanted for nothing at all." "Then I hope," she said, echoing, I think without quite realizing it, her own words to him beneath the quince tree 2 years before, "that you have finally found someone who wants nothing from you but yourself, because I do. I want nothing from you, Your Grace, that a ledger could ever record." He lifted her hands then and pressed them briefly to his lips. No more than that, for they were neither of them people who required more than that to say the whole of what needed saying, and the Reverend Mother, I noticed, had discreetly turned to study the window, and I confess I found some fault with the ledgers in my own arms that required my sudden close attention. The board hearing, when it came a fortnight later, was held in the assembly room of the county hall, a chamber I had until then only ever seen used for magistrates' sessions and the occasional dull agricultural meeting, and I confess I had not expected it to be so full. Word travels in a county faster than any post, and by the appointed hour there was scarcely a bench left empty, trustees and their wives, half the parish clergy, a scattering of the curious gentry who had heard only that the solitary Duke of Fenbridge meant to speak on some matter touching an orphan asylum, and could not resist seeing for themselves what had drawn him out of his long silence. Mr. Grave opened the proceedings with a great show of reluctant duty, speaking of irregular accounts and unaccountable sums, and the parish's prior claim upon good arable land, and I watched several of the trustees nod along as though the matter were already settled in his favor. He had brought his ledgers too, and his brother-in-law's surveyor's report, and for a quarter of an hour it seemed entirely possible that St. Ismael's would be dissolved by vote before the sun set on it. Then his Grace rose. I have seen him command a room by saying almost nothing, for silence in a man of his rank carries its own authority, but I had never seen him do what he did that afternoon, which was to speak, plainly and at some length, before a hall full of strangers, of a stormy night 22 years past, and a wakeful girl behind a cracked door, and 11 years of quarterly drafts sent without name or mark. He did not spare himself in the telling. He said outright that he had hidden behind his own charity out of a coward's fear of being thanked, and that the fear had very nearly cost the house its home rather than save it, and that he stood before them now not merely as a trustee's opponent, but as a man correcting, as best he still could, a long unfinished honesty. The room, which had been restless under Mr. Grave's dry recitations, went perfectly silent under his, and I saw more than one trustee's wife reach for her handkerchief, and I saw Mr. Grave's own face change from confidence to something considerably less certain, for a man arguing about irregular ledgers has no ready answer to a duke arguing about the truest kind of love. When his Grace finished by saying he intended, moreover, to marry the very woman his 11 years of secrecy had sustained, and to endow the house properly and publicly so that no future benefactor's silence could ever again put it at risk, the vote, when it came, was not close. A duke standing up in a public room to declare himself the long anonymous benefactor of a charitable asylum, and further declaring his intention to marry a woman raised within its walls, is not a spectacle easily argued against on grounds of irregularity. And Mr. Grave's brother-in-law did not get his orchard land. The sisters kept their house, and their orchard, and their girls, and Miss Vane, though she was not Miss Vane very much longer after that, kept her schoolroom a while yet, teaching letters to women who had once sat up in the dark the way she had, until such time as she and the Duke saw fit to open a proper endowed foundation in the asylum's name, so that no house of orphaned women in that county need ever again depend on the fragile secrecy of one man's private conscience. They were married the following spring, in the small stone chapel at Fenbridge rather than any grand cathedral, for she asked for something modest, and he would have given her the whole of England had she asked for it. And I have never in my life seen a room so quietly, thoroughly happy as that chapel was that morning. Not the loud happiness of a fashionable wedding, but the deep and settled kind, the kind that comes when two people who each believed for a very long while that no one was coming for them discover, at last, that they had been coming for each other the whole time, only very slowly and very quietly, the way an orchard grows. Every woman of St. Ismael's who could be spared from the house that day came to see her married, filling 3 whole pews at the back of the chapel in their plainest good dresses, and I noticed that Miss Vane, the Duchess, I should properly call her, though it took me some months to grow accustomed to the title, had asked that they be seated not at the back at all but near the front, among the family, for she said to me afterward that she would not have anyone imagine, on the one day she was permitted to choose her own company, that the women who had raised her were lesser guests than any duke's cousin or countess's daughter present. His Grace had smiled at that request when the Reverend Mother related to him the first request his bride had made of the wedding's arrangement, and had said only that it was exactly the sort of thing he had hoped she would ask for, and exactly the sort of thing no other bride in his acquaintance would ever have thought to ask. I recall, too, a small thing that happened just before the ceremony began. Sister Agatha came to his Grace privately in the vestry with a small folded paper, kept in the house's records since the night Miss Vane was first taken in, and never before shown to anyone. It was the note pinned to the shawl in which the infant linnet had been left at the gate. 5 words only, in an unsteady hand: "She deserves better than me." His Grace read it in silence, and gave it to his bride himself that evening, after the wedding breakfast, so that whatever she felt on reading it she might feel it with a husband's arm to lean upon, rather than as a girl alone with a candle in a cold dormitory. She wept over it a long while, and kept it always afterward beside the shawl itself, as though the unhappy woman who had left her at that gate had, in her own broken way, also been keeping watch over a door. I stood at the back of that chapel, as a steward properly should, and I confess I was not so composed as 19 years of service ought to have made me. I had carried the quarterly drafts myself for 11 years without ever once being told why, and I had watched a solitary, guarded man become, over 2 slow seasons, something nearer to whole than I had ever seen him, and I had stood in a modest parlor, and heard the truth spoken aloud at last after 22 years of silence, and I do not mind admitting that I found something in my eye that morning that had no business being there in a man my age and station. She asked me once, some years later, why I had never told her what I knew, all those times I had come with his Grace's carriage and stood by the orchard wall watching them together, knowing exactly what he could not yet say. I told her what I believed to be true, that some doors are not a servant's to open, however plainly he can see the light beneath them, and that a secret kept out of love, however long delayed in its telling, is not the same as a lie. It is only a kindness that has not yet found its courage. She took my hand that day, much as she had once taken his, and said she understood that better than most, having spent her whole youth learning the difference between being forgotten and being quietly, faithfully kept. I am an old man now, retired from active service though the present Duke, for they have a son of their own these days, and daughters after him, none of them ever wanting for a family as their mother once did, still keeps me on at Fenbridge out of a loyalty I have not entirely earned and cannot entirely explain, except to say that some households simply do not let a man go once he has stood witness to their truest hour. I still walk the orchard at St. Ismael's on fine afternoons, for the foundation my master and mistress endowed there has kept the house full of girls who might otherwise have had no one. And I like, in my age, to watch them at their lessons through the schoolroom window, and to think that not one of them sits up any longer in the dark wondering if anyone is coming, for the Duchess herself visits every month without fail, and every one of those girls knows her name and knows exactly who she is, and exactly who loves her from the very first day she arrives. That, I have always thought, was the truest measure of what my master learned in the whole long, quiet course of his courtship. That love kept secret, however tenderly meant, is only half a gift, and that the better half, the half that heals rather than merely sustains, is spoken aloud in a plain room without ledgers or distance or fear, to the one person who has waited long enough in the dark to deserve, at last, to hear it said.